Thanks, Alistair, and thank you for inviting me. It's absolutely wonderful to be here and see a few familiar faces, and great to see people from Budapest here as well. So thank you. My remarks very much follow on from Alistair's opening comments there. In particular, I'm very keen to explore this idea of what's changed politically. Obviously, we're exactly a week on since our general election in the UK. We have a new government with a massive majority, which could signify that an awful lot has changed. And yet we know from looking at the voting statistics that Labour's majority has been described as a mile wide but an inch thick, that the actual share of votes that went to the Labour Party are not much more than they had in the previous election, where they lost by a huge margin as well. So trying to negotiate and actually trying to work out to what extent has politics changed over the course of the week, and how do we account for the emergence of the rise of Reform, Britain's populist party, within the context of this landscape, is something which I think is actually a very challenging, a very difficult thing to do. I mean, Alistair just mentioning the book, my most recent book there, reminds me that I've been on a personal journey with this over the past few weeks as well, from giving my book the title, How Woke Won, and having a bit of a crisis a year ago where I thought, well, maybe actually, I was wrong and it hasn't won after all. And, maybe thanks to people like J.K. Rowling, actually there's a really huge pushback to this, and you can see how more populist politics might really have cause to be successful here. And then looking at the massive Labour victory, certainly as it appears in Parliament, and looking even at some of the things that the Labour Party have announced just in the past few days, I'm thinking, oh dear me, maybe I was right with that title, and maybe woke has won after all. You can reassure me that I'm wrong, and that I need a second book on how woke lost to come out in a couple of years perhaps. But anyway, I think one of the reasons why I find this so difficult, and hopefully I'm not the only one, struggling with working out exactly what's changed and how much things have changed, is because I think, again, as Alistair alluded to, we're taking old political frameworks, particularly an old political language, to try and make sense of the present. So often the words that we use to try and make sense of politics today, even when we talk about left and right, for example, these are very, very old phrases. I'm sure everybody here knows that left and right emerged as political terms in the aftermath of the French Revolution. So we're talking well over 2 centuries ago. And the idea was that supporters of the revolution sat on the left of the president, and those kind of more for the old regime sat to the right. Obviously, we're in an unimaginably different situation from that of going back to the time of the French Revolution. But even the idea that the left, what came out of that, sitting on the left of the supporters of the revolution, is some suggestion that left is kind of radical, that the left was the revolutionary position. And how do we apply that to a political landscape where it seems to me, certainly in this country, to be left is very much the establishment view nowadays. It's the dominant set of ideas that seems to be within the civil service, within the established mainstream media. This is not a revolutionary position. This is not a radical position, much as some of the proponents of woke thinking might like to present themselves in that way. This is very much the establishment view. But even, you don't have to go back 200 years, even within the course of my own lifetime, you can see how political positions that were once firmly established as being on the left or on the right have fundamentally changed sides. So when I was young, the Labour Party really did have at least some claim to be a party of working class people. It had connections with the trade union movement, and through the trade union movement with working class communities that simply do not exist in the same way nowadays. If you take an issue like free speech, but again, as Alistair alluded to, very important for the things you're going to be discussing this weekend. Back when I was young, the people who would argue a much more censorious position were figures like kind of Mary Whitehouse, who won't mean anything to you, but was somebody who appeared on the television very frequently, an old kind of battle axe type figure, who was vehemently arguing for censorship and outlawing things that were considered to be offensive. And she was very much considered to be on the conservative side of politics, whereas you'd hear very similar arguments being made nowadays from radical students who want the campus to become a safe space, who want offensive speakers to be no-platformed. So you can see how some of these issues have flipped sides completely from once existing in the terrain of the left and now really being within the terrain that we might label the right. It seems almost as if we've got this old political vocabulary and then we've got the reality of today's political situation with identity politics, culture wars, and the two things just don't really match up. It's as if words are kind of floating freely from the political reality and can actually be attached to different positions. So if you take the issue of women's rights, for example, to be pro-choice in terms of abortion, to defend a woman's right to bodily autonomy, is that a left-wing position or a right-wing position? Well, what about defending the biological reality of what it means to be a woman in the first place? And that was an issue that would never have crossed my mind to even think about when I was young. This was just an absolute given. Or if you take Brexit, people who support Brexit are often derided as being kind of politically on the right. But you could go back in, again, in the kind of my lifetime and look at left-wing figures like Tony Benn, who vehemently defended a democratic and a left-wing argument for Brexit. So I guess my argument is that words, the political vocabulary that we've got nowadays, is not just floating freely, but it's actually serving a different purpose. It's being used to signal something, which is not necessarily something meaningful in terms of reality, but more a distaste, if you like, of the cultural elite. So particularly in terms of what's considered to be right-wing, is often just a signalling device for things that we don't like, views that we disagree with, the we being the mainstream media, the cultural elite that dominates so many of our institutions. And so you see, this is when our rhetoric becomes inflated. If you look at particularly the language around the elections that have taken place recently for the European Parliament and the French elections, you see how words like hard right, far right, extreme right, even neo-fascist were kind of bandied around without any real grounding when you look at the reality of what National Rally or Reform in the UK, Brothers of Italy, Fidesz in Hungary, AfD in Germany. If you actually drill down and look at the reality of what some of these parties stand for, the labels of left and right, I think, actually make very, very little sense. And many of these parties have what we might have historically termed to be quite left-wing economic policies, looking at the role of the state in propping up industries or nationalising industries, and a more conservative, I would say conservative rather than right-wing approach to tradition and family values, for example, or the importance of the nation and defending national borders. Now, quite why those should be considered to be right-wing positions to defend the family, to defend the nation, is something I'm not quite sure why, how, maybe people can explain to me what's right-wing about those positions. So I think these labels, extreme right, hard right, far right, neo-fascist, these labels that seem to trip off the tongues of commentators so readily, they're really a signal of distaste. They're a signal of contempt, and they're meant to indicate really this is a kind of populist position. And by populist, really what's meant, again, is popular with working class people. Not popular with people like us, but popular with them, popular with those people who perhaps don't have university degrees, who live in northern towns, who don't share in our mindset, our cultural outlook, people who are perhaps opposed to mass migration, against net zero and the impact such a target could have upon lifestyle and their own economic situation, and people who have a growing sense of the elite being out of touch. So in this way, the more we get into extremism, the labels of extremism, far right, hard right, neo-fascist, the more it's meant to indicate that this is something which is politically unpalatable, politically unacceptable to the cultural elite. I can see I'm nearly coming to time, but I just want to highlight 3 particular problems that I think exist with this situation. The first one is that the more we label some ideas, some groups of people, some political perspectives as extreme, it suggests that the opposite to that, the people who are in charge, i.e. the Labour government we've got in this country now, or the people who are running the civil service, running universities, running the BBC, running our media, that they are somehow kind of not extreme, that they are the political moderates, that they're the sensible people, that they are the grown-ups who've kind of come back into the room. Whereas when you actually look at the positions that they are arguing for, like the idea that, a man can become a woman just by saying, I'm a woman, that we should completely transform our economy and give up on progress, essentially, for the sake of reaching some net zero target, that mass migration and pretty much open borders are a great thing, that children as young as 4 and 5 need to be taught about sexuality, that calling for the end of Israel is a legitimate thing to do. These are not, as far as I'm concerned, moderate positions. I mean, they're quite wacky positions. I would actually think that some of those things are really quite extreme positions. But if you start labelling populist movements as extreme, it gives the impression that your ideas are just moderate and sensible. I think that's a really big problem. The second problem, I think, that comes in with this kind of extremist dialogue is that it really degrades our political language still further. So I've talked about the problems of applying an outdated political language to modern situations. But the more we use up this kind of inflated rhetoric by calling kind of reform or like say Brothers of Italy or National Rally or Fidesz, far right, hard right, neo-fascist, fascist adjacent, we use those words up, and we're using those words up on parties which I think are actually not that extreme or not that far right. And so then you think, well, what language have you got left? Where do you go with your vocabulary when you do come across a group that you really do want to identify as being a potential threat? You've used those words up, we've inflated the rhetoric to such extent we're left with nowhere else to go. The very, very final point I'd make, and again this is something that Alistair touched on, I think probably this is the most important of my concerns and of the problems that I want to throw up. This labelling of extremism in the way it kind of puts a red flag, a cordon sanitaire, if you like, around certain political positions, the way it says to people, this is dangerous, don't go there, this is fascist adjacent, this is very bad. It serves to close down debate. It tells us, it kind of acts as both an explanation and a conclusion. Why do people think like this? Instead of allowing a discussion, why is it that people are concerned about high levels of migration? This should be taken seriously. We should think, why is it that people are concerned about this? Why is it that people are concerned about gender self-identification? By having the kind of big red flag of extremism, you say, well, people who've got those concerns, that's because they're far right. And that becomes a way of just shutting down the debate, of not having those conversations, of not engaging and finding out why people actually have these concerns in the first place. So I guess, my conclusion is that I think we need to stop inflating language, which is perhaps the easy part. We can challenge people to tone down the rhetoric. We can ask, what is it that's actually far right or fascist adjacent about these particular parties or this particular position? I think the more difficult part, the problem I'd leave you with for the next few days, is that we actually need a new language. We need a new language. We need to completely go beyond left, right, extremism, moderate. When we think about identity politics, about the culture wars, about the new political problems that we face today, and the new political landscape that we're confronted with now, we need new words that better describe and allow us to engage and discuss the new problems that we face today.